The title of this lecture is The Late Roman Empire Part 1. It is the first of 3 lectures dealing with the period of the late Roman Empire and its impact upon the Church. In this lecture, we will discuss 3 things. First, the crisis of the 3rd century. Second, the Church situated in this crisis. And finally, the persecution of the Church under 2 emperors, Diocletian and Galerius. Before we get to the crisis of the 3rd century, however, we need to ask a question. What exactly was the Roman Empire? According to Hilaire Belloc, the Roman Empire was a united civilization, the prime characteristic of which was the acceptation, absolute and unconditional, of one common mode of life by all those who dwelt within its boundaries. Most importantly, it was permeated by the idea of citizenship in a unified Roman state. According to Belloc, men lived as citizens of one state which they took for granted and which they even regarded as eternal. This imperial state, the Roman Empire, had reached its territorial apogee or high point under the Emperor Trajan in 117 AD. This period was characterized as a time of relative stability, referred to today as the Pax Romana. This Roman peace, in fact, facilitated the spread of the gospel across the Mediterranean world in the 1st century. Here we have a map of the Roman Empire at its height. It extended from what is today the Persian Gulf in the east to Spain in the west and Britain to the north. It was a vast empire united by an intricate system of roads, a common currency, and a military that dominated and protected trade in the Mediterranean and secured the frontiers of the empire from foreign invasion. Beginning in the 3rd century, however, problems, both external and internal, began to reveal just how brittle the empire was. According to Peter Brown, after 240, the sprawling empire had to face barbarian invasion and political instability on a scale for which it was totally unprepared. These 2 factors constitute the crisis of the 3rd century: political instability and external military threats. The external problems, military threats, came from 2 directions: Persia in the east and barbarian peoples in the west. The internal problems consisted of hyperinflation and political instability. In the east, Rome faced the constant military threat of the Persian Empire. For centuries, the Romans and the Persians had warred over Mesopotamia. In 253 AD, the Persian Emperor Shapur I defeated the Romans at the Battle of Barbalissos and took the ancient city of Antioch. In 260, at the Battle of Edessa, the Roman Emperor Valerian was captured by the Persians, remaining their prisoner until his death. While the lost territory was eventually recaptured by the Romans, war continued intermittently. Thus, fending off the Persian threat was a continuous drain on imperial resources. During this same period, Rome was attempting to maintain its frontier in the west against various barbarian nations. These included the Celts, the Goths, the Vandals, the Franks, the Suebi, and others. Now, the word barbarian derives from the Greek word barbaros, which simply means foreigner. In the ancient world, like today, it carried the connotation of being rude and uncivilized. This characterization of the peoples outside the Roman frontier was a natural result of how the Romans viewed themselves. If the Roman state was the embodiment of all that was truly noble and humane, of all that defined them as citizens and thus of all that truly mattered, then those beyond the confines of the state were by definition uncivilized. Belloc expresses it well when he writes, "The world outside the Roman Empire was, in the eyes of the imperial citizen, a sort of waste. It was not thickly populated, it had no appreciable arts or sciences, it was barbaric." Now, these barbarian peoples sometimes clashed with Roman garrisons on the frontier of the empire, hence the need for a large, well-extended Roman army across Central and Western Europe. More often, however, the barbarians crossed the Roman frontier as settlers, drawn to the rich and largely uncultivated lands of Gaul, which is modern-day France, and northern Italy. Later, as land became less available and as the Roman army became more strained in its ability to maintain its frontiers, barbarian tribes currently living in the empire served the empire as mercenaries, providing military service for pay. It was in their capacity as soldiers of fortune that the barbarians became hostile and aggressive toward the Romans. The question is, why? To answer this question, we need to turn to the internal problems besetting the Roman Empire. In response to external threats, the size of the Roman army doubled, as did the cost for its maintenance. Now, how do you provide for an army? You provide for an army by raising revenues, and you raise revenues by taxation. However, the system of taxation was inadequate to the needs of maintaining the army. The Roman system of taxation was inefficient for a large empire, and many within the empire managed to evade taxation. So the only remedy was to increase taxes on those few who paid. This led to hyperinflation. Tax revenues were chronically insufficient to maintain the army to support the empire. And so the remedy was to mint more money. And a consequence of this minting more money was, of course, a devalued currency, hence hyperinflation. During this fiscal crisis, the loyalty of the various Roman legions became tenuous. They became increasingly willing to support any leader who would pay them. As a result, you have divisions within the army, you have political assassination, and civil war. During this period, the imperial throne fell into the hands of a succession of military leaders. Over a 47-year period, there were 25 different emperors, all but one of whom died violently. Now back to the barbarians. Why did they turn on the Romans? They were simply caught up in the political instability of the time. While they were nominally loyal to the empire, they, like the Roman legions, were ultimately devoted to whatever leader promised them the most pay and the most land. And when such promises were broken, and they often were, as we shall see in a forthcoming lecture, the barbarian mercenaries would turn to sacking and pillaging Roman cities. Thus, as the empire transitioned from the 3rd to the 4th century, it was beset by military threats from without and civil war and political instability within. There was one unifying symbol in the midst of this crisis, however: the cult of the emperor. In addition to worshiping the various gods of the Roman pantheon, the Romans maintained a civic cult in which the emperor was venerated as a god. The cult mainly involved offering sacrifice, usually in the form of incense, before an image of the emperor. This practice was a testament to a citizen's personal loyalty to Rome, as the emperor was believed to be the basis of the stability and longevity of the empire. Now we turn to the situation of the church in the late Roman Empire. Christians in the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd centuries constituted a small minority within the empire. They were a small but close community within the larger Roman community. Being part of the larger community, they did share some of the same values as their pagan Roman neighbors. One thing they shared was the virtue of pietas, a Latin word which can be translated as piety or devotion. It included devotion to one's family, to the community, and to the state, and religious devotion. This fundamental virtue, pietas, fostered the typically Roman character traits of diligence, bravery, and a willingness to make personal sacrifices for the greater good. Moreover, the church was not a revolutionary movement. It taught its members to be submissive and obedient to political authority, a teaching rooted in the teachings of Jesus as evidenced by the text from the Gospel of Matthew, where Jesus says, "Repay to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and to God what belongs to God." As well as by the first letter of Peter, where the apostle writes, "Be subject to every human institution for the Lord's sake, whether it be to the king as supreme or to governors as sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and the approval of those who do good." However, the church consisted of a cohesive social organization which had a set of fundamental commitments radically different from those of larger Roman society. These included, first of all, strict monotheism, a belief in only one God, which entailed a refusal to worship the Roman pantheon or to participate in the cult of the emperor. Second, it involved a belief in the sanctity of marriage and human sexuality. Christians were taught to be faithful to their spouses and shun such practices as concubinage, adultery, prostitution, and homosexuality, all of which were widespread in Roman society. Third, the Christian commitment included a belief in the sanctity and dignity of all human life. While abortion and infanticide were common among Romans, these practices were strictly rejected by Christians. And finally, there was a belief in the spiritual equality of all people, regardless of sex or social status. This is expressed in the familiar passage in Paul's letter to the Galatians. "There is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free, there is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus." However, the area where the church clashed with the empire most pointedly was in its creed. The earliest Christian creed was simply Jesus Christ is Lord. The Greek word for Lord, kurios, means ruler or master. It was used in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, to refer to God, the Lord. Therefore, Jesus Christ is God, and thus it was to Jesus, not to the emperor, that the church directed its ultimate loyalty. The persecution the church endured at the hands of the Roman government was sporadic, off and on through the years and the centuries. We will examine the persecution under the headings of four particular emperors: Trajan, Decius, Diocletian, and Galerius. The Emperor Trajan was the first emperor to issue an official government edict regarding the Christians. "The Christians were not to be sought out," said Trajan. "This was a waste of government resources. However, if they were accused and brought before a government official, they were to renounce Christ and worship Caesar. If they refused to do so, they would be punished." Even so, there was no large-scale persecution at this time, although St. Ignatius, Bishop of Antioch, was martyred at this time, under the reign of Trajan. For the next 100 years or so, Christians endured sporadic persecution. Under Decius, however, persecution of Christians began to be more systematic and thoroughgoing. Decius sought to restore the ancient Roman civic religion and thereby restore the ancient grandeur of Rome. Pursuant to this, Decius instituted a general persecution of Christians. Up to this time, state persecutions were largely confined to the clergy. The Romans would attempt to suppress Christianity by making examples out of their leaders, priests and bishops and deacons. Decius, however, extended the persecution to the laity. He sought not to kill Christians, but to get them to renounce their faith. However, martyrdom only seemed to encourage the growth of Christianity. Tertullian, a theologian who lived at this time, remarked, "The blood of the martyrs is seed," that is, seed for the church. The most intense persecution occurred in the late 3rd, early 4th century under Diocletian. Diocletian expelled Christians from the Roman army. He ordered their sacred books handed over to the government to be burned. He burned churches and martyred many Christians for refusing to worship the emperor. The persecution continued under Diocletian's successor Galerius. However, Galerius suddenly fell ill, and while on his deathbed he pardoned all Christians, asking them to pray to their God on his behalf. And Galerius died 5 days later. So with the death of Galerius, you have what might be called the unofficial end of the Roman persecution of Christians. But it does not officially come to an end until the reign of Constantine, who succeeds Galerius. Now in our next lecture, we will discuss Constantine, his conversion to Christianity, and his attempt to construct a Christian empire.